Buenas tardes. Good evening. Welcome to the House of Spain. Today we have a nice long program for you, and but I would like to recognize two people before we start. We have the Honorary Consul of Spain, Rosaura Picasso, here over there at the back row. And also we have the previous Honorary Consul of Spain, Angelina's also. I want to thank especially Dr. Scott Dale from the Marquette University, which specializes in the Spanish Enlightenment and images of Spanish culture. He's a native of Southern California, and he has been working with me for 6 months now, and it's amazing. So thank you, Scott, for all your help and help me to put this program today here. We also have Dr. Paul Cahill from the Pomona College, specializes in 20th century Spanish poetry. His recent research also explored the lasting interest inspired by the Holocaust in Spanish poets. Dr. Julián Gutiérrez-Albilla from the University of Southern California specializes in Spanish, Portuguese, and Latin American cinema. Has published texts about the films by Pedro Almodóvar. And finally, but not least, Dr. Daniel Ares-López from the San Diego State University specializes in Iberian cultural studies, eco-criticism, and cultural environmental history. Also a poet. He's the author of a recent book of poetry entitled El Cuaderno Mundano. And with that, please help me welcome Dr. Scott Dale.
Thank you, Jesus. And hello, everyone. And thank you for joining us on such a nice day. I'm really excited about this event, and I hope you all enjoy our presentations on the theme of visualizing Spain. Now, you might be wondering what a panel called Visualizations of Spain might really be about. Are we going to talk about postcards from Marbella? Are we going to talk about photos of Manolete? How about some images of Julio Iglesias, or for the younger people, Enrique Iglesias? Or you might be asking, what's so interesting about visualizing Spain in poetry, film, and imagining the idea of nature? Who cares? How do visualizations connect with my life experiences, or all of our experiences, memories of Spain, or memories of our homeland? What is the role of imagination, and how does it connect us with our roots, identity, and a sense of belonging? Many of us in this room may have roots very far from here. And I imagine that we may often think about how images connect us with home. As we will see in our 3 presentations, our innate ability to conceive an idea, a thought, into language helps us to connect us with our past, our culture, our truest sense of identity. Now, one common thread in our 3 presentations tonight is the analysis of the mind's power to imagine, create, and adapt in the context of contemporary Spanish culture. We will talk about examples of how we create linguistic and cinematic markers of Spanish culture. That is, how does a word or an image evoke a notion of Spanish culture? In Spanish, for example, when we hear a word such as mi barrio, a complex set of images, communal ideas, and emotions are often imagined. A single language marker like mi barrio can transport us to a real space of belonging with a subset of cultural constructs. As we will hear later in our presentations, our brain's intellectual ability to recollect, remember, learn, imagine, and create allows us to relive moments, recreate memories, and reimagine nature. Now, I'm also sure of us here that many of us can think of at least one example of how a song, a photo, a smell, an image, or even a sound can flood our minds with memories of the past. For example, whenever I smell a eucalyptus tree, my brain immediately transports me back to my childhood neighborhood. Every time, just like a light switch, whenever I smell this tree. The connection between the eucalyptus tree and my roots in California is a permanent fixture in my life experience. Or, whenever I hear the 1970s song Imagine, my brain suddenly transports me back to the back seat of my parents' blue Ford Mustang when I was 7 years old, listening to John Lennon's voice for the very first time. Just a faint smell of a tree or a simple verse of a song connects me to emotional childhood memories. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room who's had this experience. Neurologists today are still learning more about how the brain makes these connections and how we remember, relive, recreate, imagine, and visualize. On many levels, our intellectual capacity to remember, learn, and adapt is still somewhat enigmatic. Now, I looked into this topic because I have so much free time. And just last week, scientists in the journal Neuron demonstrated how extracted living brain cells in a petri dish learn to play a video game, and that's a quote. In these experiments earlier this year, a computer sent signals to the extracted brain cells indicating where the bouncing digital ball was. At first, the brain cells didn't understand the signals coming from the computer. They also had no reason to play the game. So the scientists tried to motivate the brain cells using electrical stimulation. Cells began to learn the patterns of electrical activity that would move the paddle in front of the ball, and gradually rallies got longer. Yes, these extracted brain cells were learning to play the video tennis game called Pong that we may have heard of. These brain cells never got that good at the video game, but they did learn how to play. Now, about right now, you might be all asking, why is he talking about brain cells in a petri dish? And how does this connect with a panel on visualizations of spinning? Well, this experiment this year highlights the brain's innate ability to adapt, create, and connect us with learned experiences. Yes, our brains are indeed nostalgic in a sense because it behaves and recollects based on past experiences. Brain cells learn from experience to play games like Pong in a petri dish, and now we might be able to better understand how language and images in our brains can easily connect us with our past, our roots, our culture, and even emotional moments in our own spaces of belonging. It's eye-opening how the human intellect is pre-wired for sophisticated memory, learning, and adaptation. In the following presentations, we will better understand how the projection of objects, images, urban spaces, and written words in contemporary Spanish texts can evoke eternal emotions glued to our memories, both personal and cultural. Visualizing an object, imagining a space, and hearing a spoken word are often embedded in our emotional memory bank. When I see a eucalyptus tree, I am transported to my roots. The written word can be crafted to imagine, create, and transport the subject to a familiar space. Language organizes thoughts, connects us with emotions, and transports us to familiar spaces in our complex memory. As Paul Cahill will show us later, the utterances of the specific word rincón in Spanish can evoke profound memories of an emotional understanding of homeland. As we would probably all agree, a Spanish rincón just doesn't conjure up the same emotions as an American intersection. Tonight we will also learn how the creation of images in film can evoke powerful emotions from the past. In contemporary Spanish film, the use of specific images, colors, sounds, words, and symbols can often suggest memories of a painful past not yet resolved. The recollection of these cultural symbols in cinema can often produce profound emotions, sorrow, and trauma, and also the opportunity to confront and resolve sources of anguish. Our colleague Julián will show us how Pedro Almodóvar creates cinematic experiences that explore pain and regret, but also the opportunity to seek compassionate resolutions. While imaginative cinematography in contemporary Spanish film may convey cultural images of a particular time and place, the themes explored are also universal and ultimately what connect all of us together. Specific images of Spanish culture in film can evoke specific emotional connections, but almost always these emotional themes are also universal and exemplary of the human condition. Finally, Daniel Ares-López will enlighten us on specific social and cultural changes in contemporary Spain as the perceived relationship between agricultural and urban spaces was redefined in the mid-20th century. The visualized idea of nature evolved in a very short period of time. Social and economic constructs imagined personally and socially quickly evolved in 20th century Spain, as did the visualization of rural spaces. The collective imagination of what nature was exactly evolved over time as a social construct. The human intellect evolved significantly in Spain during the mid-20th century, and new perspectives of nature, urban spaces, culture, consumption, and modernity materialized. The visualization of nature and its relationship to urban cities was further developed, and, for the most part, the abstract idea of nature adopted a new identity. Nature didn't change. The trees, flowers, mountains, cows, birds, and goats still remained, but the social visualization of nature evolved into a different kind of imagined space, as Daniel will explain. So, without further delay, I would like to invite Paul Cahill to the podium. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott, for the invitation, and thank you, Jesus. I'm honored to have the opportunity to speak to you today about Spanish poetry, and in particular, I think one of the more interesting Spanish poets writing today. So the title of my talk is Dejar mis pisadas en la nieve, Winter, Distance, and Discontent in the Poetry of Merino. And the handouts that you'll be receiving have the two main poems that I'll be talking about. Okay. An important legacy left by Spanish writers in the 20th and 21st centuries is the work of Spanish poets who have written poems dealing with the experience of visiting, working, and living in the United States. Perhaps the best known examples of this include household names like Juan Ramón Jiménez and Federico García Lorca, in the form of collections like Juan Ramón's Diario de un Poeta Recién Casado and Lorca's Poeta en Nueva York. These books form part of a larger body of work, though, which includes collections by Julio Uceda, who wrote Poemas de Cherry Lane and Campanas en Sansueña while she taught at Michigan State University, and a pair of poems that Lázaro Santana and Genaro Tarens wrote during their time as visiting professors at Wesleyan University and the University of Minnesota. Their poems discuss pilgrimages of sorts to Mount Holyoke College in search of the legacy of Luis Cernuda, who taught there from 1947 to 1952. Santana's and Tarens' poems belong to collections that offer a series of glimpses and accounts of experiences in the U.S. What these more recent examples have in common is that their authors were in the United States to teach at American colleges and universities. A Spanish poet who currently resides and works in the U.S. and who also attended graduate school here is Merino, the subject of my talk this evening. Merino moved to the United States in the mid-1990s, where she earned a master's degree at Ohio State University before completing her PhD at the University of Pittsburgh in 2001. A revision of her dissertation was published as a book 2 years later as El Cómic Hispánico by Ediciones Cátedra. Merino is currently a professor of Hispanic Studies at the University of Iowa and was previously a professor at Dartmouth College and Appalachian State University. In addition to the 8 collections of poetry she has published to date, Merino has also published 2 plays and 2 novels. During the extended period of time she has spent living, studying, and working in the U.S., Merino has produced a series of important poems and collections that engage with the U.S. in spatial and affective terms. Merino's poems construct and employ a lexicon of recurring words, imagery, and concepts, use place names strategically, and focus on engagements and encounters with both spaces and people. As a result, Merino's poems offer a glimpse of the emotional impact of being in the U.S. on her poem's speaker, and offer a critical lens through which to view the United States and specifically the Midwest. The overarching emotion communicated through and by this work is a sense of alienation and estrangement as a result of the cultural differences between Spain and the United States. My approach to Merino's poetry in this presentation draws from the work of sociologist Sara Ahmed, whose premise that emotions are sticky lays the foundation for her influential study of the cultural politics of emotion, which, quote, tracks how emotions circulate between bodies, examining how they stick as well as move, end quote, and explores how some, quote, objects become sticky or saturated with affect as sites of personal and social tension. Ahmed uses this approach to develop the larger concept of the emotionality of texts, which she defines as both, quote, one way of describing how texts are moving or how they generate effects, and the way in which texts name or perform different emotions. The lexicon that Merino constructs and deploys throughout her work is made up of terms both explicitly linked to emotion, like feliz, infeliz, and tristeza, as well as terms that feelings stick to, like those that refer to and construct the abstracted urban space that appears in her work. Terms like ciudad, calles, aceras, autopistas, and semáforos end up picking up additional meaning, content, and connotations as we continue to read her work, while terms like distancia point to a sense of exile that leads to a search for rincones in an effort to find a comfortable space in the new places the speaker occupies. A particularly clear example of this phenomenon can be found in the first stanza of a poem from Los Días Gemelos, entitled La Pequeña América, in which the poem speaker explains that yo vivo en la ciudad sin la voz de mi idioma, y busco en las aceras rincones familiares, sabores que no lleven la marca de un anuncio de comida encargada por catálogo. These efforts to find a place where she might belong are largely unsuccessful, though, and this failed search is in many cases framed by references to cold weather and winter in the form of repeated words like nieve, frío, and invierno. As another poem in the same section of Los Días Gemelos states, yo sé que este no es mi territorio, que la nieve crece a raíz de las tormentas. Traces of the negative impact of cold weather on both the people who occupy the spaces depicted in these poems and the spaces themselves appear in the form of references to cracks and cracking, as we see in a poem from Los Buenos Propósitos, a collection published in 2015. Un viaje que huele a invierno quebradizo, a nieve sucia que se hiela y agrieta las texturas del asfalto. While earlier poems, like those belonging to Los Días Gemelos, tend to focus primarily on encounters with and experiences of spaces, poems included in La Voz de los Relojes and Juegos de Niños offer more sustained treatments of encounters with other people. In both of these cases, a sense of otherness and alienation underlies these poems, and like snow falling, meaning accumulates as readers move through Merino's poetry. My presentation today will focus on a poem from Los Días Gemelos, the first collection Merino published after moving to the U.S. The poem entitled La mitad de mi mano belongs to the section entitled La Pequeña América, which represents the earliest and perhaps the most sustained example of Merino's engagement with and representations of the U.S. As is the case with many of her poems, La mitad de mi mano has a complex formal structure that requires readers to unpack and establish a dialogue between different and sometimes competing threads interspersed throughout the poem. The threads in question in this poem appear in the form of stanzas beginning with La mitad de mi mano and Sobreviven. There is a general proportional balance between these two modes, with 3 stanzas and approximately the same number of verses dedicated to each type. I will now read the poem aloud. La mitad de mi mano no puede calentarse con el húmedo aliento de una boca cansada de quejarse del frío. Sobreviven los pájaros con el pico afilado y la piel desvestida de sus alas. Anidan en las grietas que quiebran las paredes y dividen el mundo en pequeños fragmentos. La mitad de mi mano se esconde entre mis dientes y el sabor de mis dedos me recuerda que existo. Sobreviven los hombres, borrachos en la acera, enterrados conmigo, mordiéndome la boca, comiéndose el pellejo de mis labios cortados. Sobreviven los gatos en los huecos ocultos de las calefacciones. Sobreviven los coches y los contenedores, las señales de tráfico y la blanca mirada del indigente ciego. La mitad de mi mano se convierte en un puño que golpea el cristal de la distancia y lo rompe en pedazos de tristeza marítima, en costras de dolor en lo soñado que nunca cicatrizan. This poem relies on a striking corporeal image to capture the speaker's experience of cold weather. The visual tension between the first three verses of this stanza, each made up of 7 syllables, and the last one, which includes 14, calls attention to the concept of dividing an object in half, first introduced in the poem's opening verse. Another important tension can be found in the difference between using the possessive adjective me in the first verse of this stanza and the more impersonal indefinite article una in the last. A sort of splitting or dissociation takes place in this instance, in which the speaker's hand cannot be warmed by the breath released through her mouth. A mouth in this case which has been complaining about the cold for a while, as the longer verse signals, with it being twice as long as the other ones. This negative framing of the cold is picked up implicitly by the stanzas representing the poem's other thread, starting with the second stanza. The four verses in this stanza describe how birds survive, including the spaces they occupy and the practice of dividing spaces into smaller units. What is not clear in this case is whether the world is divided into small fragments by the birds that make their home in these cracks, or the cracks themselves. While the cracks in this case exhibit a certain degree of agency, these verses initially highlight the birds and their survival, and I believe the phrasing and framing in this case are worth noting, that it's survival, kind of setting the bar low in terms of a life experience. The bird's survival also stands out as a result of it being the shortest of the 4 verses, a verse whose length is matched by all of the verses in the poem's next stanza. The speaker's hand, I argue, stands in for the rest of her body as it seeks to match the bird's mode of survival by searching for a place to stay. Even if this gesture ultimately serves to remind the speaker of her existence, we should not forget about the unsuccessful attempt to warm her hand up described in the first stanza, nor should we underestimate the impact that framing the outcome of these efforts as mere survival and existence has on the emotional tone the poem communicates to readers. As the poem's next stanza shows, the company of other people, and specifically men, also does not provide the sort of comfortable space the speaker seeks out. The joining of these men and the poem's speaker in the second half of this stanza leads to both a doubling of the verse's length and a visceral example of the corporeal articulation of the speaker's negative and specifically gendered experiences with others. From the close-up view offered by this stanza, the poem zooms out to a discussion of modes of survival in an abstracted urban space whose poetic form mimics the sorts of spaces or cracks one can seek out in search of a place to survive and exist. The blank spaces on the page, created by the use of alternating 7 and 14 syllable verses, replicate the visual effect of the sorts of hidden gaps the cats mentioned in the first verse occupy. The rest of the stanza offers a list of other elements that survive, although in this case without any discussion of how they do so. And this list is seemingly constructed according to both logical and acoustic associations. Cars, traffic signals, and people living on the street are linked by a more logical connection, while cars and garbage containers also exhibit acoustic associations. And this is something you see in her work in other cases where the sounds of words create different chains of associations. The larger context and effects of the speaker's experience in La mitad de mi mano take center stage when the poem closes with an image and gesture that takes the feelings accumulated throughout the poem and tells readers that la mitad de mi mano se convierte en un puño que golpea el cristal de la distancia y lo rompe en pedazos de tristeza marítima, en costras de dolor en lo soñado que nunca cicatriza. A factor not mentioned earlier in the poem, but which nonetheless plays a key role in the speaker's experience, is the distance that takes the form of what seems to be the water separating Spain and the United States. Rather than bridging this distance, the speaker's gesture instead creates fragments of sadness and scabs of pain that never turn into scars. The framing of these costras de dolor in a dreamlike or imagined context creates an intriguing point of contact between La mitad de mi mano and the Iowa House Hotel, a poem included, and that's on the other side of the handout, a poem included in Merino's second most recent collection, Los Buenos Propósitos. And the photo here is a photo of the hotel, and then the river next to it. This poem is named after a hotel located on the University of Iowa campus and offers an example of Merino's continued exploration in her more recent work of a poetic speaker's affective engagement with a space marked by cold weather. Although the photo is not taken in winter, I couldn't find one like that. This poem is in the past tense and is anchored by an intriguing blend of real and imagined actions. The real action in this case, me sentía tentada de salir a la calle, sets into motion a series of actions the speaker would undertake as a result of their hypothetical act of leaving the hotel, including bajar al río a intentar caminar sobre su capa de hielo and dejar mis pisadas en la nieve, un rastro de marcas dispersas sobre esos copos finos que se habían depositado encima de la escarcha. Even if they do not extend the parallel structure that anchors the poem's first stanza and lists what the speaker is tempted to do, the poem's remaining two stanzas are still ultimately framed by the tension between the speaker's desired walk to the river and the vantage point, the interior of the hotel, from which she looks. The fact that the speaker does not actually physically approach and walk on the river does not stop her from using a river in its frozen state, the Iowa River in this case, as a surface upon which to reflect on her current situation, in the process highlighting the power of imagination and desire in the face of unhappiness. While La mitad de mi mano frames cold weather as the source or symptom of problems, something that makes the speaker's experience unpleasant, Iowa House Hotel, in contrast, presents a consequence of cold weather, a frozen river, as a potential opportunity for the speaker to reflect and a chance to leave her mark on the space she currently occupies, even if such a mark, imagined footprints left in the snow, ultimately ends up being doubly fleeting. References to cold weather clearly play a pivotal role in the poetry Ana Merino has published since she moved to the United States in the mid-1990s, and provide a lens through which to understand and appreciate the indelible mark her work's engagement with and articulation of feeling has left, and continues to leave, on the rich archive of work produced by Spanish poets who have visited, worked, and lived in the United States. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Scott and Jesus, for this invitation, and I'm honored to be here in San Diego to present this paper in conjunction with my colleagues, Scott and Daniel. So when I was reflecting on Almodóvar and this topic, it was before he made Madres Paralelas.
Julián, un poquito más alto,
Yes.
no se te oye aquí atrás.
No? So when I was reflecting on what I'm going to present today, it was before he made Madres Paralelas. So it's very interesting that I'm showing you this still from his last film, Madres Paralelas. I'm sure you've seen it, because it is almost like a visualization, talking about visualization of my paper. And it's the way I work with Almodóvar. I mean, he did read my work, and so it's very interesting that something that I sensed came up in his last film. And what I find very interesting about this particular moment in the film is his attention to the silence, right? To this eloquent silence, and therefore already underscoring that ambivalent relationship between contemplation and action, but also about the inclusion of a trauma and the possibility of working through that trauma through a form that can contain the traumatic experience. And yet, there's always an impossibility because you create a form where it is a poem, where it is a literary prose, or where it is a film or a sculpture. But what happens with the traumatic experience is that you create this form to contain the traumatic experience, but the affects, right? The overwhelming affects of that traumatic experience leak out. So it disintegrates that form that you had constructed, right, or articulated to contain that experience. I don't want to get too theoretical, but perhaps we can talk about that after. So in 2007, the Spanish Parliament approved the Ley de Memoria Histórica proposed by the socialist government of José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero. This legislation was a response to what many historians and cultural critics have identified as a process of political, social, and cultural mourning, abreaction, and healing. This process was violently repressed under Franco, consciously silenced during the political transition from dictatorship to democracy, and historically negated by the political right. The new law afforded moral and symbolic recognition and extended rights to those who suffered persecution and violence during the Spanish Civil War and under Franco. But it did not take legal action against the perpetrators. For some, the attempt to restore legal rights to Franco's victims and to normalize historical inquiry showed the health and strength of Spain's democracy. But, as Stephanie Golo argues, the law also generated a range of controversial public statements by politicians, judges, and representatives of historical memory associations concerning the implications and efficacy of the legislation, which was seen as anti-punitive. Many filmmakers and spectators in Spain are committed to using film to confront and work through the personal and collective memories of Spain's historical traumas, the silencing, persecution, execution, exile, and exclusion of Franco's victims and the victims of the Civil War. The memory debates have certainly been ideologically instrumentalized and commodified by the Spanish cultural industry, but this has only given greater significance to the commitment on filmmakers and spectators. In the absence of institutionalized transitional justice and the ambiguities of the memory debates, filmmakers have become important political and ethical figures. And then I go back to the question of ethics. It's not about consciously saying, I am an ethical filmmaker. Okay? It's about the effects of the film on us. Okay? The debates on historical memory were eclipsed, however, by the 2008 economic crisis, and they were completely excluded from the political agenda of the Partido Popular when returning to power in 2011, until the Spanish Parliament presented a vote of no-confidence against the Conservative Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy, in June 2018, and of course, as you know, Franco was exhumed from the Valle de los Caídos a year later. The lack of interest in the debates on historical memory on the part of the PP does not mean, though, that the traces of the traumatic past have stopped affecting us subjectively or collectively. Given these continued effects, we need to keep reflecting on how the terms of the debate can be defined historically and theoretically, so we can see how the traces of trauma and fragments of memory function as an intervention in the neoliberal present. The current socioeconomic conditions threaten the subject of neoliberal democracy, as Isabel Estrada contends in her study of Spanish documentary filmmaking. Could that threat itself be a perpetuation of or succumbing to the dark shadows of the spectral past? Or could the fragments of memory, to the contrary, help us to a brighter future? In both the Spanish and Anglo-American Academy, previous scholarship has considered Almodóvar to be the most modern or postmodern of Spanish filmmakers. Cristina Moreiras proposes that his films, particularly those of the 1980s, have consistently contributed to the image of Madrid as a city of desire and tolerance. I'm sure you've seen Laberinto de Pasiones, que Madrid es la ciudad más divertida del mundo, ¿verdad? And it's true that in Madrid nobody, at that time, nobody asks you where you come from or who you sleep with, right? But so they present the city as one of Europe's most modern capitals and Spain as a modern nation throughout the post-Franco period. He is thus open to criticism for contributing to the culture of amnesia favored by many Spanish institutions, because this culture itself was deemed necessary to create a modern Europeanized phase in Spain's history. Accordingly, Moreiras notes that Almodóvar participated, and I quote Cristina, in an image of a democratic Spain that privileged subjects alienated by the spectacle of reality, oblivious to political processes, skeptical of any type of ideology except that of the market, excluded from their own collective history, and exclusively immersed in an apparent superficiality and banality. Close quote. Moreiras' rigorous attention to Spain's disavowal of the past, as made manifest in Almodóvar's 1980s cinema, raises very important questions. First, whether the celebratory embrace of postmodernity on the part of Almodóvar and of Spanish society as a whole was a release from the psychic and social burdens of the recent past, and second, whether this embrace can be theorized in terms of trauma at the heart of everyday life in the postmodern condition which David Harvey, in a broader context, has associated with the advent of flexible capitalism and increasingly uneven economic development. So Almodóvar's career, 1980 to the present, began 5 years after the start of Spain's post-Franco democratic period. And scholars often argue that there is a clear distinction between Almodóvar's early films, which show a lack of political commitment, and his latest films, which contain more explicit allusions to politics and to Spain's traumatic past. For the sake of time, I'm going to... But there is a way of problematizing the idea that Almodóvar's cinema was ever apolitical. So Almodóvar has been concerned from the onset with Spain's social, cultural, economic, and political transformations. This requires a critical reappraisal of his cinema, which, and I quote Pérez Melgoza Adrián, registered the presence of a quest that traverses all of his films, one that joins the personal and the political in the right embrace of the aftermath of a traumatic experience. Close quote. So the apparent distinction between an apolitical early period and an increasingly political later period overlooks the ways in which the past has erupted, been evoked, or been registered. For instance, Alejandro Barderi rightly suggests that Almodóvar successfully integrated the traditional castizo culture into a postmodern aesthetic using camp and kitsch. Barderi calls Almodóvar's art aesthetica heteroclita. It incorporates elements of popular Spanish culture and reworks familiar styles and genres from Hollywood into a kind of artistic pastiche. Almodóvar's characteristic collage appears as a clash of visual quotations, resulting in a cinema that cuts across genres and modes. Similarly, Alejandro Yarza focuses on Almodóvar's recycling of national stereotypes such as bullfighting or flamenco, to rescue them from the reactionary Franquist connotations. But Almodóvar's disavowal of the Franquist past up to, of course, we have this film, and then, the explicit allusions to the past will be La Mala Educación, which takes place in the 60s, right? I mean, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the late 70s, during the transition, and the early 80s, or the prologue in Carne Tremula, which takes place in the 70s, right? So that will be the only two explicit allusions to the past. So what I'm trying to do is, I'm not trying to offer a psychological history of Almodóvar, one that rediscovers in the films the hidden truths of Almodóvar's unconscious, nor should we approach the relationship between aesthetics, ethics, and trauma in Almodóvar's cinema by focusing on his conscience, intention, or ethical and political commitments. So this presentation is not an argument, even though Almodóvar's authorial signature is predicated on his appropriation and subversion of popular cinematic genres. Authorism remains the most common scholarly approach to Almodóvar's work. This can be explained by Almodóvar's, and I quote Paul Julián-Smith, determination from the very beginning to devote as much time to promotion as to production, close quote. So this presentation departs from a conventional authorist approach, I think, with rather than about Almodóvar. And as the capacity, as Scott was saying about the way in which the image, right, produces thinking, right, as opposed to applying a theory to the image, the image itself produces, thinking. So, so I'm just going to, how long do we have? Okay, well, so that I could go on and on. So, I guess what I'm gonna say just to end is that so the way I see this Almodóvar cinema is an aesthetic practice in which a traumatic event may or may not reverberate in our subjectivity and body by means of our affective and interpretive encounter with the traces of the irreducible other. It shows how traces of trauma and fragments of memory, and I quote a Brazilian psychoanalyst, impinge upon concrete reality, but also upon intangible reality, close quote, and affects us on a spectral and material level. And to finish, instead of just thinking about a reflection, right? So what is our position? What is our ethical position, right? Could be, different, but it seems to me that instead of thinking about a reflection, right, of reality, the cinematic medium participates in the transformation of our consciousness of reality. And so we have to adopt, and I'm not trying to be, it's a proposition, right? So let me formulate it as a question. What if we adopt an ethics of listening and seeing, of contemplating, right? Which may help us to sustain a variety of human life, a kind of otherness. And I can talk about why I'm thinking about irreducible alterity. So there is no empathy. Empathy is necessary, but it's not about, I can share your suffering. I cannot share your suffering, right? And that's the only way in which, if we recognize that we cannot share the suffering, but we can, I cannot be identified with your suffering, I cannot fully identify with your suffering, but I can share, I can bear witness, indifference with your suffering, that will be the condition of possibility for democratic memory. So it a kind of otherness, and encourages to work toward a national culture that pays much deeper attention to caring and compassion, and I differentiate compassion from empathy. Only such a culture can sustain the safety and dignity of all others and the different ways of being in the world. Thank you.
¿Cómo están?
Muy bien,
Bien. Todavía con energía para escucharme a mí.
Sí.
Sé que es un poquito tarde, ¿verdad? Bueno, good evening, everyone. It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here with you in this half of Spain in Bilbao Park, and I'm also very happy and honored for this opportunity to share my work with the San Diego community and the community of the House of Spain. And I'd like to thank Scott and Jesus for organizing this event and inviting me. This evening I would like to talk about two things. First I will tell you what I do as an interdisciplinary researcher in the humanities, why my approach to Spanish culture and history combines approaches from different disciplines, and that are typically considered different, very different, right? And why I believe that is important now, at this moment in history. In the second part of my presentation, I will sketch some of the main themes and concepts of the book I am writing on Spain's cultural and environmental history, and that's the plan. Okay, so let's start. The modern history of Spain, and especially the 20th century, with all its social and political drama and its cultural flourishing, and we have an example from Almodóvar, has always been a hot topic for both scholars and the public in general. The rise of a revolutionary left at the early 20th century, the colonial wars in Morocco and Africa, the artistic and literary avant-garde of Picasso and Lorca, then a brutal civil war, then a harsh fascist-like dictatorship, and then the thrilling transition to the democracy in the 1970s. 4 generations, all those events have captivated Spaniards and millions of people outside of Spain. And of course, I have also an enormous personal interest in all that, but as a scholar, I'm also interested in the historical processes typically studied by environmental historians, which were less spectacular and mediatic, but whose long-term influence might have been much greater. As a general term, we can call them processes of modernization. As it is well known, the ideological and programmatic basis of modernization developed during the 18th and 19th centuries, during the so-called scientific revolution, industrial revolution, and modern agricultural revolutions, which also included global expansion of international trade, and we are of course in one location that is important, international trade like San Diego, and also the dark side, right? Slavery, but also good and dark side like international migrations and colonialism. That is also part of modernity. Sometimes people forget that, but for me it's united, right?
Yes.
As in many other regions of the world, in Spain, it was not until the central decades of the 20th century, when maybe, many of the people here were born, I was born in 1978, not that far, that these modernization processes in Spain and in other regions of the world really expanded, intensified, and accelerated, causing what may have been the most radical social, cultural, environmental transformation in the history of the Iberian Peninsula, since the spread of agriculture and herding in prehistoric times. Environmental historians call to this recent and short period, in the 50s and the 70s, in some countries a little bit earlier, in the history of the Earth, the Great Acceleration. I regret now not having a PowerPoint because I have on a slide, I didn't thought about it, but if you see many indexes, for example, water consumption, energy consumption, exploitation of fisheries, and many others, emissions of CO2 to the atmosphere. Everything is until the 1950s, everything is kind of little bit, increasing. But when you get to the 1950s, it goes up very abruptly. And the 1950s is like 2 days ago, right? So there is in the material history of the Earth, and that of course includes culture, that period, 1950s, 60s, 70s, and then of course until now is like crucial, and it's something that is called the Great Acceleration, right? Industry existed before, but at that time, cars existed before, but it was at that time where there was an explosion in that sense. It is in this period, roughly between 50s and 70s, as I told, when the distribution of human, animal, and plant populations in the peninsular territory changes rapidly and radically. When agriculture is transformed into agro-industry, when the energy regimes that sustain our ways of life radically change, especially with the massive use of cheap Middle Eastern oil and other fossil energy sources. And when cars transform the mobility practices of the popular classes in Spain, 60s, 70s, right? And when consumerism and tourism explode. As a result of all this, the roles of meanings assigned to living beings, both to wildlife and to domesticated animals or plants, and to other material entities in the Spanish state territory, like rivers, minerals, mountains, the coast, the ocean, changed. In recent decades, many of the processes I have mentioned have been studied by agrarian, industrial, or environmental historians. These have focused mainly on studying the evolution of modes of production, use of forests and other natural resources, the flows of materials and energy across the Spanish territory and the world, the natural ecosystems, etc. However, these socio-environmental processes have hardly been studied from the perspective offered by cultural history or cultural studies. When cultural historians have paid attention to the historical interactions and interrelationships between society and the environment in the Iberian Peninsula, their main focus has been the study of the national landscapes. That is, the discursive constructions of a territory as a symbol of a nation and its values. And it's something every country has, right? Like the typical national landscape that represents the nation. There are several reasons, in my view, for this relative lack of attention to the relationship between the human and the non-human. The first is the dualistic and anthropocentric vision of reality that we have inherited from one of the ideological pillars of modernity, that is the rationalist philosophical tradition, from which emerged the division between nature and culture, matter and mental life. All those oppositions, human subjects and natural objects. And between, and the second cause, and is a consequence of the first, is this disciplinary division of academic work between those who study nature and those who study cultures, or between those who study material processes and those who study cultural, mental, or discursive ones. My academic work is based on the idea that this is a division that is worth rethinking, and even sometimes get rid of it. And the question now is why? Why we have to cross, right, the natural science and the disciplines that study culture. Why is it could be a good thing to cross boundaries? My answer to this question is inspired by the intellectual tradition of science studies developed since the 1980s by scholars such as Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway. And according to this intellectual tradition, the main reason why we must overcome the divide between nature and culture, or society and the environment, is that in the planet we inhabit, those areas are mixed and entangled in such a way that it is impossible to separate one from the other without completely misunderstanding the most important events in planetary history since the extinction of dinosaurs 66 million years ago, when one of that is climate change, with its cascade of unpredictable consequences for human and non-human life on Earth. And the other is the massive global extinctions of a species that is currently going on. Let us see a well-known example so that this intimate relationship between the material and the semiotic is clear. Let's think, for example, about how destruction and massive consumption of a substance like oil, which took millions of years to form in the subsoil from organic matter, is entangled with scientific practices in the fields of geology and chemistry. With nationalists or sometimes imperialists, I'm thinking in putting, for example, political ideologies of progress and economic growth. Countries have to grow to be successful, right? And then it is important. With territorial planning projected from a grid of freeway networks, something that happened in the US, right? They create a grid of freeways that organize life and the territory. And with the symbolic constructions of the automobile as an experience of individual freedom, family well-being, and mastery of space. Think about those apps about Land Rover, conquering the mountains of Colorado or whatever. And all this is also mixed up with wars and aggressive neocolonial geopolitical strategies that I'm seeing every day in the news, with atmospheric changes and global climatic imbalances, with the fights of indigenous peoples for their ancestral lands in places like Ecuador or North Dakota, and with many media, film, and literary narratives that are inserted in all this mess, establishing sometimes the narrow, discursive and affective parameters of public debates. Let's see now how this approach to history at the culture-environment interface is deployed in my current book project. The title is Modern Wild Natures, Cultures of Nature and Iberian Wildlife in Francoist Spain, 1940-1980. And it tries to answer two basic questions. The first is how the historical relationships between humans and other species of living beings contributed to the configuration of modern Spain. The second question is, which has been the role of nature, the environment, and wildlife in the formation of Iberian modernities? To answer these questions, I have traced and analyzed historical changes in the relationship between different groups of people. Writers, like Miguel Delibes, for example, sports hunters, natural scientists, forestry engineers that were very important during Francoism, peasants. Spain was an agrarian country and it still is, but it was an agrarian country until very recently, and television audiences, among others. And also living beings typically considered as wildlife, like deer, partridges, native forests, wolves, birds of prey, and even African gorillas in zoos, etc. My focus is not only on Spain's peninsular territories, but also in the West African lands colonized by the Spanish state since the 19th century, and which later, after 1968, became the country of Equatorial Guinea. In the introduction of the book, I elaborate a concept that has allowed me to explore the diverse forms of understanding and interacting with wild animals and plants at a particular historical moment, and the hierarchies in cultural and social consideration among those forms of looking and understanding animals and interacting with them. This concept is cultures of nature. Cultures of nature are sets of material, semiotic practices of work, leisure, artistic, different practices that involve interactions with non-human living organisms or inanimate matter, like fauna, flora, minerals, ecosystems, etc., and which demand focusing one's attention on particular features of them while ignoring others. Cultures of nature weave together cohesive ways to conceive, perceive, feel, and interact with the non-human world. In this way, they generate, by material but also cultural or symbolic means, different natures. We can call them different natures that are open to change, mainly because the contours of those natures depend on the continuous actualization of material and semiotic processes, material and semiotic practices, and networks that may change for different historical reasons. And also wildlife change. You know, we can see it every day, you know, like the gulls before tourism were not so aggressive in the beaches, you know, probably they, you know, wildlife is in contact with humans, even in remote, of course, in Yellowstone and in national parks, there are lots of humans, and everyone that knows those places know that wildlife change. Coyotes, you know, they are with us, and their behavior is changing all the time. So it's not only the culture change, but also, you know, the behavior of animals change, of course. They do, every animal do that, right? With time, sometimes takes time. Some examples of modern cultures of nature are agro-industrial extractivism, which looks at the non-human world as productive spaces or deposits of natural resources. Sports hunting, that in Spain was very popular and still is, which is wildlife as killable game or sometimes vermin like wolves. To the other animals, they rarely pay attention, right? And conservationism, which sees wildlife and natural spaces as a heritage, national heritage in need of management and preservation. And last, landscape excursionism, which perceives the natural world aesthetically as a series of landscapes. Cultures of nature are distant but not independent from one another. The constant friction, contact friction, or overlap between different cultures of nature can give rise to mutual support, hybrids, tensions, or even sometimes violent conflicts. Let's explore the meaning of cultures of nature by reflecting on the question, what are Iberian wolves? What are Iberian wolves? Could be applied to here. What are wolves? A reasonable answer, if someone asks what the first what we do, I go to Wikipedia. When I don't know something, I go to Wikipedia, and then you have the scientific definition, and probably it's the best way to start, right? If one asks that question. So if we go to Wikipedia or to a scientific dictionary, even better, we will find a complete definition of the species. You know, what is, but yet, I think this would be very insufficient answer because Iberian wolves are living beings with a mostly independent social existence. They don't need us to live, which ultimately cannot be reduced to the different ways humans perceive and conceive them. You know, if we disappear from the earth, you know, they would have their own social life, their social organization, with alpha males and all that. So we cannot reduce them to that kind of scientific definition. It's useful now. Nonetheless, the diverse and evolving forms of symbolic mediation and modes of perception and action through which humans have interacted with Iberian wolves in the last centuries, for example, scientific observation, conservationism, hunting, vermin eradication, television shows. I will talk later about Félix Rodríguez de la Fuente, that maybe some of you know that show from the 1970s. Are much more than a social construction of wolves. They have had dramatic consequences for the history of humans, Iberian wolves, and their habitats. The Spanish state, for example, promoted their eradication. They wanted to wipe them out until the 1970s, a point at which the species was nearly extinct. And in the US, they did the same, so this is not, in this case, it's not Franco's fault or whatever. Because of their sporadic attacks on livestock, and legally protected them in some areas afterwards, making them a still controversial natural national heritage. These are the kind of cultural environmental stories, a history of culture of nature might unveil. Stories that include real wolf populations that have learned for centuries how to play the hide and seek with humans, popular politics and stereotypes about evil wolves with roots in the Middle Ages, and that my grandma told to me, they're still alive in the rural Spanish rural world, and successful nature documentaries like Félix Rodríguez de la Fuente, Fauna Ibérica, that was a wildly successful show on the national Spanish television in the mid-1970s, which by means of a careful staging, because there were tricks, it was a nature documentary, but were good tricks. I think that he did a great job, but there was a careful staging with human acclimated wolves, and of course cinematic technique, the zoom and that closeness, very related to the idea of effect. Portray wolves for the first time as caring parents, happy families, caring families, and of course part of a national natural heritage. And I'm to finish last thoughts about this for a history of modern Iberia at the culture-environment interface, looking at cultures of nature as an evolving and conflict-breeding ecology of material semiotic practices, which take place both in particular environments and also through the pathways, conducts, and networks of modern capitalist societies, allow us to understand how the cultural, the material sides of socio-environmental change develop concurrently. A possible historical lesson might be that trying to change one or the other separately, for example, trying to change the dominant ideas about the environment by promoting alternative ideas, more nature-friendly if you want, or trying to change the global flows of energy and materials without transforming people's knowledge, values, and practical skills. And for me, that's important. It's not only good intentions, but know how to do things. Is at the same time. If we don't do both changes at the same time, and for that you need, people collaborating, basically from different spheres. And for example, engineers trained in humanities department, right? Because there are people that is going to have very powerful, I don't know who created the grid of freeways in the US, but probably was an engineer, right? And if that engineer was collaborating with an ecologist, that were very good ones in the US history, and some of them like Rachel Carlson or whoever, maybe, the construction of that would be different, right? So yeah, and I finish here. Thank you for your attention. I know it's late.
Well, thank you very much. And I know that you guys have questions, and we also have some hors d'oeuvres, some tapas with sangria. There's beer, there's water, and cool drinks. And then we can mingle with the four speakers, Scott, Paul, Julián, and Daniel, and talk to them personally in Spanish or in English, and socialize with each other. So with that, I would like to give a little gift of appreciation, and this has to do with the history of San Diego. I think it goes with the movies, it goes with poetry, and it goes with environmental. This is the book of Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, the latest information that was found by Dr. Wendy Kramer from the University of Toronto in Canada. She's the supreme study in cabildos in the South America, and I would recommend that you start reading chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then you can come back and read the prologue and the preface and all of that. So with that, I thank you very much for coming, and hopefully we can do that some other time. Thank you very much. Yes. And with that, I want to thank you also to Maruja and Bob Williams for getting all the food and all the drinks. So with that, let's enjoy each other.